Thanks so much for joining me today for a Salon talk on the ancient Roman head of a noblewoman. I'm Catherine Sawinski, and I'm Assistant Curator of European Art at the Milwaukee Art Museum. We've got a lot to cover with this object, so let's dive right in by taking a look at the sculpture. It's made out of Pentelic marble. So Pentelic marble is quarried at a location called Mount Pentelicus, which is north of Athens, Greece. The marble that comes from here is fine grain and white with a slight golden tinge. It was such high quality that it was used for most of the major monuments and sculptures in classical Athens, such as some places you may be familiar with, the buildings of the Acropolis, and of course, the Parthenon. It was the first white marble to be used in significant quantities in Rome during the 2nd century BC. The Romans used it for architectural decorations, statuary, and sarcophagi. I've been asked if this is the same type of marble used in the floor of the Calatrava building. But I think if you look at them side by side, you can tell that they aren't the same. The floors of the building are Carrara marble, which is quarried at the mountains of Carrara, a town in northern Tuscany in Italy. It has a gray background with a light gray veining. So our sculpture is a bit smaller than life size. Also, the back of her head is unfinished. I think you can see that much better in this view, which is taken from the side. It might not be finished because it may have been placed in an alcove of some sort. This could have been on view in a public area or in a funeral niche. So Romans cremated their dead and put the ashes in urns at underground communal tombs that they called columbaria. Here is a photo of a columbaria, which was discovered in Rome in the 19th century. The word columbaria comes from the Latin word for dove. Romans used it to describe the tomb structures because they resemble dovecotes. In the tomb, a portrait bust would be placed in a niche with the ashes, and you can actually see in this vintage photograph of the columbaria that there are some sculptures in place in those niches. You may have also noticed that the head of a noblewoman is damaged. She's missing about a third of her left side, a good chunk out of her chin, and a portion of her hair at the top. Of course, for a 1900-year-old sculpture, this is probably not surprising. Marble can be fragile, and it can be broken. Fragmented ancient sculptures like this appeal to our modern eyes, because we're used to modern artwork that uses asymmetry and abstraction. But in earlier centuries, broken ancient artwork was often restored. In the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, a fragment of an ancient sculpture was not as desirable. So artists of the time created restorations so that the work would read as a complete whole. New pieces were carved to complete ancient fragments, and sometimes even multiple ancient pieces were incorporated together into a single statue, even if they didn't belong together. By the 18th century, a market had developed in these ancient fragments so that artisans could create what we call pastiches that collectors would want to buy. I mean, obviously, if you're trying to make a living doing this, you'll produce what people want to buy from you. Sometimes changes to the original ancient fragments were made to make them fit together with the new composition better. These interpretations often led to new creations inspired by the original, but are really a misunderstanding of it. During the 19th century, the interest in restored sculpture began to wane, and eventually restorations began to be removed, especially when the materials used to attach them began to fail. Here, I'm showing you an example of this phenomenon demonstrated with a sculpture in the collection of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. On the left is the sculpture with its restorations, which were removed by conservators at the museum in the 1970s. What the sculpture looks like now without these restorations is the picture on the right. In Milwaukee, we can actually see evidence of this practice in two different places. So we in the museum collection have this a Roman torso, which at one point had restorations. We know this because there are holes cut to hold the rods that would keep the pieces together. In this photo, you can see the hole at the neck, which would have held a restoration head. And these two additional photographs show the arms and the legs that would have been attached in these holes that would have held the rods as well. Meanwhile, there's an ancient fragment with its restorations still intact on view in the city, if you go to the Villa Terrace Decorative Arts Museum. So the sculpture of Hermes in the entrance courtyard is actually an ancient torso with restorations. The restorations are said to be from the 17th century, so they're extremely early, and that the statue originally stood in a villa in Rome. Before it was bought for display at the Villa Terrace in the 1960s, it was on display in a different American garden. So here's a detail of the only part of the sculpture that is ancient. And you can actually tell this because it's a different color than the rest of the sculpture, because it's aged differently. So this begs the question, was this sculpture originally Hermes in antiquity? And the answer is we really can't know, because with just this portion remaining, there's so little of it that you really can't tell if that's what it was. So just understanding that this can be the case raises questions of how we study ancient art through restored sculptures. In the case of Hermes, the story of the statue was created is probably the most interesting one, because the restoration is actually part of the history of the artwork itself. Studying restorations has opened a new line of research for a number of art historians who are exploring the history of taste and collecting. The key is to recognize what is restoration and what is not, no matter why you are studying a piece of ancient artwork. Going back to our head of a noblewoman, I can tell you that it also at one point had restorations. I know this because there's correspondence in our object file between Tracy Atkinson, who was director of the Milwaukee Arts Center at the time that the sculpture was purchased, and the dealer who sold the head to the museum. And these letters actually refer to the restorations. In fact, we know that the restorations were sent with the sculpture when it came to Milwaukee on approval, which means that it was sent ahead of time for us to decide if we wanted to buy it. Tracy, the director, decided that he liked it better without them. Unfortunately, there's no photo in the file of the sculpture with the restorations, even though there's one referred to. It really makes you wonder what happened to them. Anyway, now we're going to take a look at something that was probably your first thought when you saw the sculpture. What is up with that hair? So I love studying Roman women's hairstyles. Just as today, hairstyles changed over time in ancient Rome. So this is actually how you can assign a date to a portrait. So what do we have here? Curls piled high on the front of the head, kind of looking like a honeycomb, which is one way that these curls are described. And then there's a braid curled into a bun in the back, and you can just see that made out on the left-hand picture. So this style was worn at the end of the 1st century AD and the early 2nd century AD. This was during the Flavian period, or during the reign of emperors Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, and the early Trajanic period, which is during the reign of the emperors Nerva and Trajan. So I've dated our head to be from the very end of the Flavian period, or AD 96 to 100, because of the specific proportions of the pile of curls. It's pointy at the top. To demonstrate how hairstyles let you date portraits of Roman women, you can compare the Flavian Trajanic hairstyle of our sculpture with other hairstyles like the one shown on these two portraits. On the left, we have Sabina, the wife of Hadrian, who around AD 130 wore lovely waves similar to sculptures of Greek goddesses. Meanwhile, in the late 2nd century AD, Septimius Severus's wife, Julia Domna, who is on the right, is known for her helmet-like rolls of hair. There is no consensus as to whether the empresses and other high-profile women set the fashion for hairstyles. We don't really have proof that they set them or they followed them. What we do know is that hairstyles for both men and women changed slowly over time, so there was likely an interest in what others were doing, just as there is today. You always keep up with the latest hairstyle. The hairstyle worn by our noble woman is called the Orbis komarum in Latin. This literally means sphere of hair. I think you can understand why it's called that. Scholars actually usually refer to it today with a French phrase, toupee coiffure, or sometimes with the German version, which is toupee frisure. Toupee refers to the section of curls piled high over the forehead. Although now we associate a toupee with an artificial headpiece used to cover a bald spot, it actually originally meant any roll of hair just above the hairline. This interesting hairstyle was depicted in marble to varying success. Ours is quite detailed with very well-defined curls that actually use some great Roman technology. They had a hand drill that they would use to actually drill out the holes in the middle of the curls. It adds great realism and a lot of great shadowing to make it look very three-dimensional. This is comparable to many Flavian period portraits, such as these two, including one of the wife of Emperor Domitian, which is on the right. The masterpiece of this hairstyle is this portrait in the Capitoline Museum in Rome. It's usually referred to as the Finesca bust. Other versions of the hairdo did not look quite so successful, such as these two. So there is a question, you know, did the style change slightly over time? And that's why some women's hairstyles look more flat and applied than others. But, you know, the question is still open. But you can really, again, see that these types of portraits show you why calling them a honeycomb is pretty appropriate. Although the curls on the portrait take center stage, if you look along the forehead, you'll see a symmetrical band of what looks like hair. Notice the waves carved as if it is hair that's combed up and over a fold that disappears under the curls. It almost looks like a headband. If it didn't have the lines on it, we probably think that it was a headband. It's possible that it's both, a form that the hair has been styled over. This band also helps date the sculpture to the very end of the 1st century AD. Although it's hard to see in the photos, the remainder of the hair behind the curls is intricately braided and pulled back into a bun. For many years, it was assumed that Roman women could not have possibly achieved this elaborate hairstyle with the hair growing out of their head. These have to be wigs. But recently, using not only contemporary writings and archaeological findings, but also real-life experiments, the consensus is that these hairstyles could have been achieved with a woman's natural hair. One Baltimore hairdresser's fascination with ancient hair led her to experiment with these styles on real women. Her name is Janet Stevens, and she was so captivated by a sculpture of Julia Domna at the Walters Art Gallery that she decided to try to recreate it. She has since analyzed other hairstyles through artwork and has referenced ancient texts in order to figure out how women actually did it. With her practical experience, Stevens was able to prove that in most cases, the hair is not a wig. Rather, it is the woman's own hair, and perhaps with some additions if her hair was not long or thick enough. You can see Stevens recreating a number of styles on YouTube. What Stevens has done is a type of experimental archaeology. This is just what it sounds like, testing a theory about the past by actually doing it. It's like reality TV for historians, which can be both educational and entertaining. So as a professional stylist, you can make this, but how did Roman women do it in antiquity? So curls were made with a type of curling iron called a calamistrum. It was made out of iron and was hollow. You can see some illustrated here on the left. The calamistrum was heated in the coals of a fire, and then the hair was wrapped around it. We know what it was called because a number of ancient writers refer to it, including Cicero. So hair was held in place with hairpins and combs, just like we would use today. And you can see some examples of them on in the picture on the right. And even hair could be sewn together with thread. Beeswax was the most common substance added to make hair hold a certain shape. Imagine the time and skill that would be required to make this hairstyle. The woman must be a lady of at least some leisure and wealth if she's able to take the time to do this every morning. She's definitely not doing household chores required to run a household. It's very likely she even had a slave to do it for her. We know that a well-off household would have had one slave that would work on the hair of the woman of the house. This would be the slave's only responsibility. The slave who did the hairstyling would have been called an ornatrix. This funerary monument at the State Museum in Trier, Germany, shows an ornatrix styling the hair of the woman sitting in the middle. As fascinating as all of this is, in the Roman world, a woman's elaborate hairdo and the hours she would take getting ready in the morning is more than just a way to make herself look beautiful. If you think about it, the very fact that she can just sit around shows that her family has a certain social status. And having the social status meant that her portrait was not just a way to remember her as a person, it is also a way to send important messages. With that in mind, let's take another look at the sculpture. We know that this is a portrait. If we pass this woman on the street, we'd probably be able to recognize her. But at the same time, she's strangely lacking a personality. She's extremely calm and shows very little expression. Her skin is smooth and youthful. This demonstrates how Roman portraits, particularly of women, are an intriguing combination of realism and idealism. Portraits like this reflect the role that Roman matrons had in society. Namely, their power came from the fact that they moved between the private and public spheres. Women had to be modest, yet beautiful. They had to be cultured, yet demure. A woman's outward appearance was a direct reflection of her important role. She needed to run the home efficiently and bear children that would become moral, productive members of society. She was crucial for the very basis of Roman society, which was necessary for a peaceful and prosperous state. Because of this role, women could be used publicly as examples of why the Roman Empire was so powerful and moral. Consequently, there are just as many portrait heads of women as there are of men. The use of female portraiture to convey messages to the public started early in the Roman Empire. For instance, the demure hairstyle and expressionless face of Livia, the wife of the first Emperor Augustus, reflects the modesty preferred during the previous historical period, the Roman Republic. This image here was made to assure citizens that having one man, namely Augustus, in charge, rather than a full council of men, was not something to be alarmed about, but everything was just okay. So I think you can see that Livia's hairstyle is very calm and pulled back very nicely from her face. And, she kind of evokes this very important message that Augustus wanted to send. Her hairstyle also countered the Eastern decadence of Cleopatra of Egypt, the lover of Mark Antony, Augustus's rival for power. It was such a powerful message that Octavia, who was Augustus's sister, used the same hairstyle. So here you see Livia, his wife, next to his sister, Octavia, on the screen. As you can imagine, when your very portrait can have such heavy meaning, ancient women had to strike a tricky balance. They were expected to be attractively coiffed, but it was bad taste to be too ostentatious in your appearance. There were even laws to govern the use of luxury items, one of the many regulations Augustus put in place in an attempt to reinstate the traditional values of the Romans and stabilize society. Emperor Augustus also used art as propaganda to emphasize the need for these types of virtues to his people. The culmination of this is the Ara Pacis Augusti, which I'm showing you here. Literally, this translates to the altar of Augustan peace. This monument to Augustus's success in bringing civilization to Italy through conquest is a structure surrounding the sacrificial altar and is full of meaning in every nook and cranny. The most prominent friezes show members of the emperor's family in a procession, preparing to conduct a religious sacrifice at the altar, which is actually in the middle of the structure. You can see part of that frieze at the bottom of the screen. Through this particular use of portraiture, Augustus makes his own family the moral model for the Roman populace. By doing this, he also claimed power for his descendants, including the women, who were immortalized in stone as good wives and mothers. The struggle between extravagance and modesty required of leading families of the Roman Empire were reflected in the writers of the time. Women and men are often satirized for spending time and money on their appearance. But at the same time, the elaborate hairstyles Roman women imposed on their hair was symbolic of virtue. The Romans actually saw hair as an outward symbol of sexuality. Long flowing hair was only for the young and for prostitutes. Adults, particularly moral adult women who were married, contained their sexuality literally through their controlled hair. The sculptural nature of Roman hairdos represents the correct social morals of that particular woman. The takeaway here, ancient Roman portraits are always sending messages. It's always political. The place of the individual is of interest, but the more important part is the individual's role in society. And don't forget that using realistic to describe Roman portraits is not as straightforward as it may seem. Now, we've noted the expressionless face of head of a noblewoman. Part of this is the result of those blank, staring eyes. Would it surprise you to learn that when it was originally made, her eyes would have had painted pupils? That's right, believe it or not, in antiquity, marble statues were painted to make them appear more lifelike. This is called polychrome. Painted marble seems very strange to us because we are used to this glowing white stone, which for centuries has been touted as one of the most beautiful things about ancient art. So just to prove the point that this actually did happen, I'm showing you here two examples of polychrome sculpture that were recently excavated at Herculaneum in Italy. Because Herculaneum was submerged in lava from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, the pigment was protected. You can see in particular in the picture on the left how the pupils for the eyes of the woman are painted in. She even has colored eyebrows, colored hair, and eyelashes. A traveling exhibition which has been on view in Europe and the US presents the research of one of the leading authorities on ancient polychrome, Dr. Vincenz Brinkmann. Here's his suggestion of the coloring for the Augustus of Prima Porta, one of the most famous statues from ancient Rome. The original marble that is at the Vatican Museum is the picture on the left, and then the Brinkmann recreation suggestion is on the right. Although there's much discussion of how accurate his particular colors are, he has certainly made it clear to the public that ancient sculpture was painted. So paint will naturally flake off of stone over time. So after many centuries, sculptures would obviously look less colorful. White marble became the preferred aesthetic in the history of Western art, in large part due to the influential writings of German art historian J.J. Winkelmann, who included ancient Greek and Rome into the history of European art. So he kind of folded this ancient culture into European art. He actually pushed the narrative that ancient sculpture was not polychromed, writing that any culture that did have polychrome sculpture was clearly unsophisticated. So he definitely had preconceived notions of what polychrome sculpture meant. This is despite the evidence. Ancient sculpture with remains of polychrome were being discovered all the time. Here are two watercolors made during an excavation on the Acropolis in Athens in the 1880s, showing clearly the bright paint that was still attached to them. In fact, the amount of paint was so striking that the top sculpture became known as the bluebird pediment due to the color of the creature's beard. So if you go to the Acropolis Museum in Athens today, you can actually see the sculpture in person and see the pigment on it. Despite this, polychrome on ancient sculpture is usually ignored by scholars. In some cases, overzealous cleaning and scrubbing to clean them has been done to remove even more pigment, which has led to the accusation that those who know better have been purposely doing so that they appear smoother and whiter. This happened to the Parthenon sculptures at the British Museum in the 1930s, something that the British Museum didn't admit to until 20 years ago. In contrast, Now the historical context and technological study that pigment on sculpture offers has been brought to the forefront. For instance, here are two images of paint that you can see on the Parthenon sculptures at the British Museum, both with the naked eye on the left and through a special technique called visible induced infrared luminescence on the right. In general, conservation treatment is much less invasive and usually requires that anything that you do to an artwork can be easily reversed. Hopefully the interest in studying the paint on sculpture will continue to grow so that we can learn more about it. So our final topic for consideration of our head of a noble woman is provenance. For many ancient artworks in museums, provenance is a thorny problem. This is because so much of material culture of ancient civilizations has been dug up illegally and sold by looters. Not only does this mean that we lose the information we can gain from the original context, but it also can support a black market in antiquities that takes advantage of regions worldwide that are in crisis. Consequently, art museums have put into place guidelines for acquiring ancient art. The most important is this one. It's called the UNESCO Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export, and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property. If you're not familiar with UNESCO, it actually stands for the United National Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. In other words, this is the division of the United Nations that seeks international cooperation in the areas of education, science, and culture. Since its founding, UNESCO has worked to get countries to work together to end the theft, looting, and illicit trafficking of cultural property. The convention I just mentioned adopted a statement in 1970 to urge countries to take measures to make this effort actually work. It's the date of that convention, 1970, that art museums use as their guideline. Institutions that follows this guideline do not acquire archaeological material or ancient art unless they can prove that the objects were outside the country of discovery before 1970 or were legally exported from that country after the date. As a result, a number of art museums do not acquire artwork unless they know the provenance starting in 1970. In addition, some art museums have now made public the works in their collection that have missing provenance after 1970 as a way of being transparent. Of course, this doesn't mean that anything with known provenance before 1970 has not been looted. It merely sets some parameters for a field that has none before. There are still a lot of problems with ancient material on the art market, and the reason that the Milwaukee Art Museum will likely not acquire anything ancient for its collection. What does this mean for head of a noblewoman? Well, it was accessioned by the museum in 1966, which means we fulfilled the UNESCO 1970 guideline. According to our files, it was purchased from the art dealer Spink & Son in London. It's the only thing that the museum has purchased from them. Unfortunately, there is no further provenance in the file. Can you imagine if we had more information on where the sculpture came from? It would be so exciting. Although we can learn a lot with generalities like I've done today, it would be even more meaningful to have all those specific details. In the meantime, I continue to do research on the provenance, and maybe someday we'll be able to fill in some of those holes. So I hope that you enjoyed our focused look at the Roman head of a noblewoman today. And when you're able to get back into the galleries, maybe you'll stop by and check her out in person. Thank you so much.